Hi guys! Today we're going to be talking about Fiona McWilliams' article, Louisa May Alcott's My Contraband, and Discourse on Contraband Slaves and Popular Print Culture. So it's a pretty interesting article. She begins by explaining the backstory of contraband slaves. So if you look on your handout, I don't know if you'll have it up at the same time as this video, but on the handout it talks about how contraband slaves began. And so in May of 1861, the Atlantic Monthly published an article on the beginnings of contraband slaves. And so this talked about the Second Confiscation Act of 1862 and how the slaves of those helping the rebellion would be, quote, forever free of their servitude if they reached the Union Army. And so this was the beginning of the contraband slaves would escape to the Union expecting to be freed, expecting to have emancipation, and unfortunately that did not happen. So instead of freeing these people and giving them full freedom, the Union soldiers and people would take in these slaves and make them their quote-unquote contraband. So whenever they would take these slaves, they equated them with goods seized from the Confederacy, such as weapons and cotton, and thus constrained the dimensions of their humanity. By 1863, more than 26,000 contrabands were under the protection of Union forces. So this just furthers my point of slaves just wanting to get to the north and be freed, but instead of being freed like they expected. Williamson goes on to talk about how these people were classified as property and denied any sense of selfhood. The contraband has watched others exact authority over every aspect of their lives. There is more than a hint here of many Northerners' wish that African Americans would simply disappear from American life, and that redefining them as contrabands would hasten the process. And so we see this in a lot of different things in American history. McWilliams then goes on to talk about the media's commodification of contraband slaves. She does this through referencing Vanity Fair and Atlantic journals and things like that. And she quotes here in this first part of your handout, through the exchange, we can also trace a pattern of the appropriation of Black identity via the contraband slave and their commodification in print media. And so these sketches that would depict contrabands were explicitly racist. They talked about how their speech was impaired, their physical features were inhuman, they were intellectually competent, and these comic strips would treat them as if they weren't even people. You appreciate McWilliams trying to get others to realize that this was not North versus South. This was white versus black. This was not Confederacy versus Union. This was person against person. And that whenever these slaves escaped to the North, they should have been freed, and they weren't. They were treated as commodities, even by the media. The media's push of getting all of this out there was a commodification of humans, humanity. And so it was really difficult for me to wrap my head around this, because I had always learned that the Union and the Confederacy were the two opposite sides. But then this author does a really good job at stating that no, blacks were treated as inferior in both. He was making fun of contraband so they didn't have to deal with the fact that they too were treating Black people as slaves. They were just calling them by a different name. Finally, the author gets to Allcott's piece. It takes about 10 pages of historical context to get to Allcott's actual piece, which was difficult. So I'm going to give you a summary of Allcott's piece really quickly. This is basically the story of a Union nurse named Faith Dane and her mixed-race contraband servant, Bob, or aka Robert, worked together to care for a patient who ends up being Robert's white half-brother, a rebel captain. Dun, dun, dun. Once Robert finds out that this is indeed his brother, he plans to kill for kidnapping and raping Robert's wife, Lucy. Nurse Dane talks him out of killing his brother, however, and even transforms Robert into a Union soldier. The fight in the Battle of Fort Wagner. The story is explicitly subversive and interracial desire, with Nurse Dane attracted to Robert, but she repeatedly calls him hers and refuses to abandon the thought of him being contraband altogether. She calls him hers, she calls him property, she calls him contraband. She wants a romantic relationship with this man, but is not willing to sacrifice her personal lack of intellect. So ultimately, this relationship does not go well. But it wouldn't have worked well anyway, because Robert loved his wife before she died. And so
analysis.
And this piece is about turning slaves into commodities. The term contraband caught on rapidly, precisely because it provided a means for Northerners to continue thinking of escaped slaves as property. Allcott hurt more than she helped the existing conversation of contraband slaves by romanticizing the idea of Robert, ultimately having him killed on the side of the quote that I have is that Nurse Dane's use of Robert speaks to the status of contraband slaves as a fetish object and source of erotic pleasure, then as a tragic mulatto with a more romantic than fiction past, then as a brave African-American soldier who sacrifices his life for his country, then a contraband, again reunited with his wife in heaven. This is a romanticization. I can't talk. This is a romanticization. This is a romanticization of contraband slaves. And McWilliams does a great job at trying to depict Allcott as not really knowing what she's doing by romanticizing this struggle between contraband and slave and a person versus commodity. But ultimately, the question is Allcott to blame? And so before we can answer that question, we have to look at a couple more themes that Allcott talks about in this publication. And so she talks about miscegenation as a loss of identity. And so by making Robert half black and half white, she discusses the lack of identity in miscegenation. These people do not fit in the black community and do not fit in the white community. They are out of place in both situations. Robert does not fit between a slave and... Did you finally get in? Because I'm trying to do a video.
Where was I?
Miscegenation produces a lack of identity. Whenever these children are born with a black mother and a white father, or vice versa, these children don't fit in. They have the missing piece of, am I black, am I white, am I a slave, am I a commoner? And so by having Robert be this half and half, Allcott is stressing the importance of finding your identity in other things rather than your skin color. Finding your identity in things that are rooted inside of you rather than perceived by others. So the question remains, where does Robert belong? And so I'm going to read you a quote really quickly. It is on the battlefield that Robert becomes useful both to the country and within the narrative. In serving and dying for his country, he finds both purpose and place. Allcott uses all of these elements to make Robert a romantic character, one meant to evoke readers' sympathy. Robert's label contraband carries cultural value, marking him as a figure of derision and symbol of anxieties over race. At the same time, I wonder if we are willing to declare Allcott guilty of the charges made in The Abolitionist and the Contraband. Are we willing to put a label on one of the greatest American writers of all time and say that she aided in the spread of racism? I conclude with what viewing My Contraband alongside the history of contraband slaves and the eventual push toward emancipation reminds us the road to freedom was not a straight or smooth one. It took years to get emancipation. And whenever people say that it was the Union versus the Confederacy, they're wrong. This was blacks versus whites in the Union and the Confederacy, in the North and the South. And for many, even Allcott, it was difficult thinking of African Americans having a place in society. And so my last quote I have, for many, even Allcott, envisioning a place for ex-slaves in American society and indeed acknowledging the possibility of their agency and even the possibility for citizenship was simply unimaginable. This article does a really great job at bridging the gap between the Confederacy and the Union. And it does a great job at trying to convey the importance of the media and how it spreads So I have a couple forum questions that you guys can answer, and I'm really excited to hear your responses to them because I think that McWilliams would have done a way better job at establishing her thesis earlier on if she would have addressed these questions. And so I think that's one place that this article does fall in. So the question remains, do authors such as Allcott help or hurt the spread of racism and all of these different social and political issues that spread across the nation so easily in the media? Does the media help? Do we even need the media? Those are questions that McWilliams did not pose and that I needed in order to get as much of this article that I could have. Overall, McWilliams does a great job at trying to bridge the gap between the Union and the Confederacy through fiction such as Allcott's My Contraband. But she never comes to a clear conclusion of what exactly that means. She asserted that Allcott is part of the conversation, but she never asserted whether or not that matters. She never asserted clearly that yes, she did help or no, she didn't. This was not a persuasive essay. This was a historical context, getting a reader to understand the differences between the Confederacy and the Union and how that played out in fiction like Louisa May Alcott's My Contraband. Thanks, guys.